Well, so your history as a scholar has been really, been to be involved with these practitioners, and probably more than most, if not all, scholars.
I think so.
And also that we've interviewed, or whom we've interviewed on this show, in terms of really embracing that relationship as necessary to your scholarship. Your colleague and friend, Dr. Anne Nellie Perret-Clairon, explains.
She told me what she was going to talk about, but she did not send it to me because she knew that you didn't want her to.
She explains that you work simultaneously at different levels, building projects nationally and internationally, also with practitioners that we've spoken about prior. On all these levels, you are not a teacher who knows in spite of everything that you know, but an interlocutor in search of learning for yourself and for society. You are still making major contributions to understand minds at work and what structures and enriches these minds, and how they communicate and share experience and knowledge. Your contributions provide a kind of learning that does not neglect neither contents nor social relations, a sustainable learning that has long-term effects. Your colleague and friend, Dr. Mary K. Stein, notes that you first
in whose
office we're sitting right now, notes that you first worked also with practitioners in Community School District Number 2, which I believe that's where Alvarado was the superintendent.
Yeah, we got a grant with Tony, and Mary Kay and I were the two scholars on it.
Okay. And she notes that some of your most significant accomplishments is this work here, but also on something called an exemplar effort-oriented system. Does that ring a bell?
No.
An effort-oriented system of schooling?
Yeah, we used the effort-oriented language at that time to suggest that anybody could learn anything if they worked at it. And that was as opposed to inherited ability. There was effort-induced ability. So we were trying to argue against the people who believed in fixed intelligence. So I used that word at the time. I guess Tony liked it, and the grant givers liked it. So it did some work for us at the time. Now I prefer to talk about learnable intelligence and just not, because effort sounds like, I just don't like the word as much. It's fine.
Okay.
It's a word that's okay, but it's been picked up by some of the people, mostly those running charter schools, to say we're going to develop grit as part of.
Very trendy.
It's very trendy. I don't think they're wrong.
Right.
I think developing grit is
important,
and you do some things you don't want to do. I have a granddaughter who taught for a couple of years in a charter school in Boston, and she wanted to leave it because it was so much grit oriented. But on the other hand, she said, I loved the kids, and I actually loved their family. She was just telling me this last night when we were sitting with my husband, who's in the hospital. And she loved the families, and she went back to visit them last weekend, the weekend before last, to visit the kids, and in cases where families came in. She was happy to see the families too. And they value this grittiness part. They're immigrant families who understand that their kids have to conform. And they needed the intellectual skills, but above all, many of them would say, they need to know how at the beginning you have to prove that you can take what life delivers. So the parents were not unhappy with the kind of schooling that Eliza had learned to appreciate, in which it wasn't just about working. It was about working hard, but it wasn't just about working hard. It was about trying to figure things out and having the right to ask questions.
You mentioned something just a second ago, and you also mentioned it earlier in the interview about fixed intelligence. Will you talk a little bit more about that, also in the context of what teachers believe to be, in your experience?
Well, Americans rather deeply believe in fixed intelligence, and it's an inherited intelligence, and that leads many people to be comfortable with saying, okay, this is a smart person and this is a not so smart person, and we can't expect that to be very different. They are willing to recognize that there could be smarts hiding behind a low education of the family, but by and large have been taught by psychologists that there aren't too many of those mismatches, that the kind of families that produce kids who don't do spectacularly well on IQ tests are they're not spectacularly smart. That doesn't mean they're dumb, but if you've got a crisis and you need to pick people who are going to learn quickly, let's say as we did in World War I.
Sure.
And that's where this European idea of inherited intelligence moved into America in a way that the Europeans never really used it. Well, they used it for selection. And they used it for selection into the Army in 1914.
Right.
But also for selection into schooling tracks. And before, schooling tracks existed, but it was how you did in school that led you into your track. And then it became more and more essentially IQ tests. The Stanford Binet was a Stanford version of the Binet tests Binets were all interview tests in Paris. There's a whole really interesting story there, because
Right.
Binet didn't want to do what the Paris school board wanted him to do. He said, we can't do this. It's not, my tools as a psychologist don't work. And I said, forget about your tools. Figure out some way that we can sort the kids out. This is at a time when massive immigration was happening within France, from the farms into the cities, and especially into Paris. And a lot of those families were illiterate. And they stick their kids in the public schools, and it wasn't working. The schools didn't know what to do with them, and and so they asked for help. And Binet was not a main track professor, so he had some time on his hands. He was willing to. So first he said, I can't do it. My psychological training doesn't give me anything to do this with. And they basically said, find some other way, do it. And he agreed to try. And what he developed was a whole series of questions about ordinary life, that a kid who was getting what was considered ordinary exposure to life in Paris, walking in the streets, sitting in a cafe, going to the market, whatever the things are, questions that they would be asked that the average 3-year-old could answer, and another set that the average 4-year-old could answer. 5 and 6, and gradually putting this together into a test that you could administer orally to individual children that could pick out if they were way behind in cognitive development or way ahead.
Mm-hmm.
And that worked for Paris in 19 whatever it was. It was something very early in the 20th century. Then Americans, with their taste for measurement, come along and want to make this a written test, or at least one that could be much more systematized. And so they build the Stanford Binet. And that's going to get used for sorting kids into tracks. And then it gets used for dealing with the problem of all the people who are signing up to join the armies to be sent over to Europe, which jobs they would get. and then it becomes paper and pencil, I think. I'm not sure of exactly when it becomes paper and pencil. And as research started to go on, because not everybody was willing to believe that that intelligence was that fixed.
Mm.
But as research went on, a strong contingent of psychologists and other scientists came to, they developed the statistical techniques that really were showing great differences between social classes. And it was the adoption studies that seemed to nail the thing. So if kids were given up for adoption, the liberal thinking people at the time, as now, felt or believed that the kids adopted into the smarter families would start to behave like the rest of the family. And the geneticists were mostly British guys and some Stanford guys, I think. Anyway, the Brits were the ones who first developed this. They were saying, no, it's the reason that they're poor and come from poor families is that they're not so smart.
Mm.
Well, the adoption studies were showing that the adopted kids were coming out closer to their birth families than to their adoption families. And that data is showing, it still probably shows up.
Sure.
So that's the idea of effort and ability. What we were trying to say in the 80s and 90s, and even into the 2000s, is that we don't really care what your native ability is. If you're willing to work, and we can get you some good help, good teaching, you can do anything you want. That's what the message actually was. There were a couple of articles in semi-popular journals like Daedalus and the AFT Journal and some other one that were making this case.
One of those articles was your mismeasure of learning in 2001.
Was it?
I believe so.
I don't remember that.
In terms of how we operationalize tests and think about tests,
yeah,
in terms of what we know about our students.